As we continue to reflect on the life of Carter, let's detail some of his policies and maybe the politics surrounding Jimmy Carter. So, to do that, I would like to bring into the conversation now Seth Radwell. So, he is an independent political analyst. Seth, good to see you.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Carel, and it's great to talk to you about Jimmy Carter.
Of course, no, we're glad to have you here. I guess let's just set the stage for our viewers, right? So let's go back and maybe detail a little bit about the political, social, economic climate in which Jimmy Carter was first elected.
Sure. I mean, we have to go back to the 70s, which was really in a crisis for a couple of reasons. It's a situation where we were just in the post Vietnam era and as well as the Watergate era. So there was a tremendous lack of confidence in the government and in the country overall. And Carter was elected, and he beat Ford. Many voters were at the time frustrated that Ford pardoned Nixon following the Watergate scandal. So that was how he came into office as kind of a new type of Democrat. But here's the thing: I think in the end, Carter had a very interesting life, and his presidency was fascinating. He was overall a meticulous humanitarian, and he was principled in everything he did. Throughout his life, and especially during his presidency, Carter was never afraid to take steps that he felt were necessary, even when they were highly unpopular. He had a very strong moral compass.
You mentioned a little bit there about the steps that he felt were necessary to take, even if they were unpopular. So, Seth, if you wouldn't mind, maybe just going a little more in depth on that point.
Absolutely. So there are a couple of them. I think the first one that comes to mind is human rights. So in this time frame, we had a tremendous set of refugee crises. If you remember, we were coming out of the post-Vietnam War. We had the Cambodia and Vietnam boat people, where there were tens of thousands of refugees in Southeast Asia that Carter ordered American ships to pick them up. They were fleeing by boat, and the exodus intensified, and he announced, I think this is in 78, that the US would double the number of refugees it accepted monthly from the region. And if you think about it, today that would be quite unpopular given the issues that we kind of face with the sentiment in the country regarding refugees. Another instance with that was the Mariel boat lift in Cuba. This operation was very interesting. Carter referred to the boats as freedom flotillas, and he welcomed Cubans fleeing Castro to come to Florida. So I think the first thing is about the first thing to point out is his record on human rights, which might have been unpopular. He was also a humanitarian, and he never forgot the importance of striving for peace across multiple dimensions. One example would be the Camp David Accords, which never would have happened without Carter's dogged tenacity. He also continued the normalization with China that was started by Nixon and signed many accords with Deng Xiaoping, who was the Chinese leader at the time. He also pursued SALT with the Soviet Union rigorously, even though it was unsuccessful. So we see in a lot of areas him pursuing what he thought was right based on his moral judgment during his presidency.
I think another way that I would like you also to format maybe that answer would be, I mean, we just had an election year, right? So we really focus heavily on this Democratic and Republican candidate throughout an election cycle. And through that, there's distinctions made between someone who's more conservative or someone that's more liberal, obviously not to an extreme, but we do have almost those variants, if you will. Where would Jimmy Carter fall in that line, that spectrum?
Well, it's very interesting because he doesn't fit cleanly on the conservative liberal dimension. I mean, many people, of course, think of him as a liberal president, and he did do many achievements which were liberal, like government job creation. He appointed more women judges than all of his predecessors. He established the departments of education and energy. And it's interesting that one of Trump's mandates potentially is to take apart the education department. He also early on had a great far-sighted support of alternative energy, and he had many efforts to help us achieve energy independence. So all of those things might be considered more on the liberal side, but he had other policies which were much more conservative. For example, he continued the deregulation of the airline, trucking, and natural gas industries. Now, this is something that ever since Reagan, deregulation has become kind of a very much a conservative mainstream effort. But Carter very much pursued that, and that would be considered more conservative. Similarly, he was conservative in terms of his efforts to balance the budget, which many of his liberal Democrats didn't want him to balance the budget, but he was very convinced that it was important to do that, and so he pursued balancing the budget efforts throughout his presidency. One last thing that I'll mention, which was really not really liberal or conservative, was his pursuit of the Panama Canal program of giving it back to Panama. Now, at the time, he maintained that we risked tremendous guerrilla warfare in Panama unless the U.S. made a plan to return the canal to Panama control. Why is that interesting? Because today, of course, in recent days, Trump has discussed potentially taking back the Panama Canal. So again, all of these things are fascinating, and they are not. Some of them are liberal, some of them are conservative, but it doesn't fit the mold of what we think about today. And one last point I'd love to make is that one of the important parts of Carter's legacy was not only his presidency, which in many ways was not considered a great presidency for a bunch of reasons, which we could talk about, but it was his post-presidency legacy. He kind of set the stage in a way for after he left the White House, taking on a whole bunch of initiatives regarding what he thought was important. And he kind of reinvented the ex-presidency with this higher purpose that has since inspired other presidents to use their stature and power on behalf of important causes after they leave office. So his ex-presidency was also very important.
Going back to when he was actually president during that one term that he did hold in office there. As you mentioned, there were some of these policies that weren't so successful and some that were controversial, as you also mentioned. But can we talk about maybe some of these that fell short of the expectations that Jimmy Carter had and maybe what we learned from that in all of the years afterward?
Sure. I mean, well, this is something that I studied a fair amount when I was working on my book, American Schism, which is a tracing of the divisions in the country. And what's interesting about Carter's presidency, which he was one term, he was beset by tremendous problems, many of them outside of his control. So, first of all, he had a horrible economy. And after the American hostages were seized in Iran, the oil crisis further exacerbated the economic framework. At the same time, there was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. So, in a way, he had tremendous challenges that, to some degree, weren't brought on by his actions, but which he didn't deal with successfully. So, for example, he was considered a political failure for not achieving success with the hostages. Many at the time thought he should take military action. Carter maintained that to do so would risk the hostage's life. But I think it was ultimately based on the economic crisis with oil and the hostage Iran situation that led Reagan to a stunning election victory, which pushed Carter out of the White House.
Let's talk about his involvement, of course, after that presidency as well. So we speak a lot about all of these humanitarian efforts that he did all across the globe. But maybe if you can bring a focus how involved in politics he remained even after his time in the Oval Office.
Well, what's so interesting about that, Carol, is that he focused on what he thought was the center of his moral compass. So for example, he got very involved in Habitat for Humanity. And famously, after his White House term, there were many pictures of him building homes. Habitat for Humanity was a very important organization. There you have some pictures on the screen. Him and Rosalind were very, very involved in this and really brought this whole organization to another level. I think Habitat for Humanity built thousands of homes across the world. So that was one example where, since homelessness and poverty were such important issues for him, he really he really grasped onto that effort and made it his own. And what's funny about it is, besides being a leader as an ex-president who could speak with the power of a voice and a platform, he himself worked very hard, as you see in the pictures, of opening up new initiatives for Habitat for Humanity. There were many other situations like that. For example, he worked very hard on human rights. He fundamentally believed that human rights was a moral issue. Of course, he was a evangelical Christian, as he called himself, and he had a very strong belief in the sanctity of human life. And it's somewhat ironic that today's Christian community sometimes has let go of some of the things that he was so vitally important and driving, like poverty assistance, homelessness. These are issues that, as a Christian, he thought were fundamental, and today you hear that less. From some of these movements, not entirely, but certainly less. It's not in the front lines of what you think of as the Christian community advocating today. Now, I also think it's important to recognize that his work in the Middle East, by forging this incredible Camp David Accord, earned him a lot of plaudits. Of course, Sadat and Begin at the time both won the Nobel Prize. Carter was awarded the Nobel Prize 20 years later, I think, after he left the White House. But that was a key initiative that would not have happened had it not been for his persistence. I also think his work in terms of keeping the opening with China going was very important, because one of Nixon's successes in the term before Carter was this new opening to bring China back into the international dialogue. And Carter very much successfully moved forward on that, while still pushing China and the Soviet Union on what he saw as a poor record on human rights. So he was able to dialogue on this and bring the human rights issue to bear, while also pursuing concrete policies that helped bring China, for example, back into the discussion globally.
I want to bring Jimmy Carter into 2024, so to speak. And if you can maybe explain to us some of the policies that we have seen recently, whether it's with the current Biden administration or President Trump, former President Trump's, now President-elect Trump, maybe the policies he had before that, and which ones you think most align with some of these values that Jimmy Carter had, and maybe which ones he would be most opposed to.
I think it's a very interesting question, Carol, because the debate around immigration, which of course has become one of the staunch points of this election season, is very ironic in many ways. Of course, I think many people who are concerned about immigration are rightly so, because we have lost control of our borders, and that's unfortunate. But fundamentally, Carter believed that we are a nation of immigrants, and that pursuing legal immigration and giving people a chance to build a life here was one of the moral imperatives of our country. And I think that's to some degree lost today, unfortunately. And that I think is, in some ways, given his passing, we should reflect on that. I do think both parties are to blame for us not being able to successfully manage our border, and it's become uncontrollable, which is why so many people are upset about it, rightly. But at the same time, we need a legal immigration policy that's consistent with the reason why America has become the envy of the world, if you will, because we're a country that allows people, regardless of where they're from or what rank they're born into, to be successful if they work hard. That is part of the American dream. And I think that was central to Carter's legacy.
Well, Seth, we have covered a lot when it comes to the politics of Jimmy Carter during his presidency and afterward. But before I let you go, is there anything you would like to add that maybe we didn't discuss that you think is important?
Well, I think in today, I think Americans have shown in this last election cycle how much trust they've lost in government in general, both at the federal level and in terms of our institutions. And I think Carter's dedication to using those institutions to pursue positive ends is an example that we should all learn from. So I do hope your viewers will take a look at Carter's legacy. Again, he was not considered a successful president because of all the disasters that happened, like the Iran hostage situation and others. But in retrospect, he accomplished great things. And I think he'll be remembered with a better legacy than he was when he left office.
Seth Radwell, independent political analyst, we do appreciate your time here at Live Now from Fox as we reflect on the life and legacy of Jimmy Carter. Take care.
Thank you so much, Carol. Pleasure to be with you.
Of course, you as well.